I'm truly honored to speak at this symposium commemorating the 50th anniversary of Kessler's Nobel Prize. But when I first learned that I'm invited to speak here, I thought it is a rather peculiar choice on the part of the organizing committee, because I've never had the chance to meet Kastler, and when he passed away, I was just a young undergraduate student in Novosibirsk. But as I was preparing this talk, I realized that, in fact, my connections to Kastler are much more profound than I myself have expected. And so, as a result, I'm going to present a rather personal talk to you. On my office door in Mainz, there is this South African wisdom written out appropriately in Kastler's native language. And it says that a man continues to live in his children, in the trees that he planted, and in the words that he said. And I think that this applies very well to science. And the children are then scientific children in this case. And in fact, as a sort of aside before my talk, I'd like to say that a major theme in my life is atomic parity violation. And you can think of it in the following way. Normal electromagnetic interaction of an electron with the nucleus can be described by a photon exchange between the electron and the nucleus. But there is a heavier brother to the photon, which is a gauge boson, Z neutral gauge boson. And the interference of these two interactions leads to very subtle effects in atomic spectroscopy. In fact, here is a brief history of atomic parity violation. It was first proposed in the 50s, even before the discovery of, long before the discovery of the Z boson. It was sort of proposed as a curiosity. And Zeldovich wrote in his paper that the effect is so tiny, even though it's a curious effect, but it should probably never be, will never be observed. And in fact, that was the case for many years before, in the 70s, Mariam and Claude Bouchiat actually realized how to do this. And this is a picture that I took in 1995 when I was for a few weeks a visiting scientist at the Laboratoire Kastler, Brussels. And these are the Bouchiats, and they made it all possible, the whole story possible. Now, this is not a very easy field to be in. And in fact, I entered this field myself about here. And my highest aspiration in life was to one day participate in an experiment that actually sees parity violation. And in fact, this came through about 26 years later already at Berkeley. And we've seen actually a rather large parity violation effect in the Terbi, and we are continuing to work in this direction. Let me now turn to actually the topic of my talk. I'm going to say a few words about optical magnetometry and tell you about two platforms, vapor cells and nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond that are presently used for magnetometry. And then I'll give you a few examples. One of them is an unusual kind of nuclear magnetic resonance detected using such magnetometers. And then I will tell you about magnetometry in the sky a little bit, and then mention briefly how we use magnetometers to try to understand what dark matter is. So this is an ambitious program, so I have to get going pretty quickly. So optical atomic magnetometers, they can be sort of mentally separated into three processes that sometimes go simultaneously, but nevertheless you can distinguish them. And it's a convenient way of of understanding how magnetometers work. And what do you think? Number one, of course, is optical pumping, where you shine polarized light on atoms and transfer the light polarization into the atomic polarization. then the atomic polarization evolves in the presence of the magnetic field, and then you once again use an optical field to probe how much the polarization evolved, and then you back off what the magnetic field was. And in fact, just from this very picture, you can immediately estimate the quantum limits on magnetometry. So here you have the sensitivity, and you want this number as small as possible. And then there is a magnetic moment of an atom, some fundamental constants, the measurement time here, and then the product of the number of spins you are using and the coherence time, which is basically if you prepare polarized atoms, how long this polarization will persist. And so there are not, if you want to optimize a magnetometer, there are not too many letters here to optimize. It's basically this product of these two. And one of the ways to make a good magnetometer then is to increase the relaxation time. And I should show you here something that sits on my desk. This is, in fact, a copy, a reprint of Madame Bouchier's thesis. And you notice that the preface to this thesis was written by Alfred Kessler. And I should say, I just recently reread it preparing this talk, and this is just an example of clarity of writing. This is a beautiful preface where all the important things are said in less than 2 pages. And I'm happy to say that the magnetometers are mentioned right there early in the beginning, and then he continues to say that it's important to make the relaxation time longer, and then points out that one can do this in a glass vapor cell, either by putting some buffer gas or putting some coating on the inner walls of the cell. And this is, in fact, the topic of Madame Bouchier's thesis, and he goes on to explain how Madame Bouchier was able to actually bring this to the range of a few seconds, and he ends by saying that this remarkable scientific work also shows that things are sometimes more complicated than you would think initially. Anyway, I'm happy to say that so what Madame Bouchier has achieved there with her advisor, Professor Brassel, was a few seconds of a relaxation time, and that was sort of state of the art for some 40 years or so. But a few years back, we were able to improve things a little bit in terms of the coating. And already, I should say that these coatings that Madame Bouchier produced for her thesis is a miracle, because if you think of a polarized atom, it can bounce 10,000 times and remain polarized. And here we have 1 million bounces. And I should show you our version of this picture. You see this vapor cell that Professor Kastler is holding in his hands. And this is our version. This is this little vapor cell with which 77 seconds of relaxation time was achieved. And this is Mikhail Balabas, who is a wizard of producing this kind of coatings. So just to give you an idea what is involved in an atomic magnetometer involving such cells, these are not terribly sophisticated devices. Let me first explain the physics. So we, in this case, we are coming in onto a vapor cell with linearly polarized light. And then we pump an atomic polarization that's represented by this angular momentum probability surface. Now, if we have a large magnetic field applied, then this kind of polarization will rapidly average, and this wouldn't be good for our magnetometers. So we play a trick along the lines of what was suggested by Bell and Bloom many years ago, which is to use a kind of a stroboscopic excitation. We take our light on and off resonance synchronously with the Larmor precession. And then we detect this precession by observing optical rotation of this linearly polarized light when it is transmitted through the cell. And based on this, we put together a very simple device. It contains a diode laser, not much more sophisticated than this laser pointer, maybe less sophisticated, a couple of polarizers, the vapor cell, and then a polarimeter. And then when we apply modulation at a certain frequency, we see very, very sharp resonances in our signal. And the width of these resonances is basically given by the inverse of the relaxation time. So they are very, very sharp. And so if you park your system at the slope here, you can measure magnetic fields very precisely. One of the advantages of such a stroboscopic technique is that not only you can measure near zero magnetic field, but you can actually, you have another family of resonances here, similarly sharp, which you can put anywhere you want, in particular in the geophysical range, and then you can make magnetometers that are good for measuring magnetic anomalies of the Earth field. Now let me briefly describe to you another platform for magnetometry that became popular only in the last less than 10 years, I should say, maybe since 2008 or so. And this has to do with diamond. Now, this is a jewel here, and you see all these beautiful colors. It's a really nice diamond here. Now, these days, you can order online a perfect single crystal. This is here is typically a few millimeters by a few millimeters. And when you look at it, it's exceptionally boring. So the moral here is that the beauty comes from the defects, and there is a particular type of defect that we like. It's called nitrogen vacancy center. The idea is that you have all the carbons in the lattice, and you take two adjacent carbons, and you leave take them out. You leave one of the sides vacant. This is called the vacancy, and then you replace the other carbon with the nitrogen. And so this object here, some people call it artificial atom or artificial molecule, is what is of interest to us. Now you can do the simplest experiment using just this laser pointer that I'm holding in my hand. You take a piece of diamond, and this was the one where we put a lot of these defects intentionally in, and you shine the green light, and maybe you can see there is kind of yellowish, reddish fluorescence that comes out of there with this green excitation. And if you look at the spectrometer, what you see is actually there is a sharp line that's called a zero phonon line, and then a broader phonon sideband. So this is the simplest nitrogen vacancy center experiment that you can do. Anyway, if you draw an energy level diagram, it looks like this. The important thing is that the ground state of the nitrogen vacancy centers is a spin triplet, and therefore this state is sensitive to magnetic field and electric field, and it can be as a sensor. And okay, what do we do to do a magnetometer? We start with optical pumping, which turns out to beautifully work just by shining light and not worrying about polarization, direction, or anything. Just shine green light and do some magic of what's going on here, which I don't have time to explain. You initiate the state to this ms equal to 0, and then you can manipulate this by microwave field, and so on and so forth, and you make an optical magnetometer with all these three components that I said: optical pumping, precession, and optical probing. Here is a typical setup that you can have. You come with a green laser, you shine on the diamond, and then you have a dichroic mirror, and you observe what's coming back on you. And if you now take a dilute diamond, you can see that there are actually individual spots. And oftentimes these days we work with just one single nitrogen vacancy center as a magnetic sensor. Okay, so now I described two magnetometry platforms, vapor cells and nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond. And now I would like to give you a couple of examples of how magnetometry is used today. And one example is a rather strange kind of application, which is zero field nuclear magnetic resonance. Now, traditionally, when you're doing nuclear magnetic resonance, you want a very high field, because there are also three stages here: polarization, encoding, and probing in magnetic resonance. And you need your magnetic field in each of these stages. So typically, in NMR, you use thermal polarization, but you can play some clever trick, like, for instance, optical spin exchange, optical pumping, and not require magnetic field here. If you work, I mentioned already single quantum systems. If you work with a very small ensemble, then you can do away with polarization at all and just use spin noise, spontaneous polarization. Then you also don't need magnetic field to polarize. The next stage is NMR is that you want to write the useful information into your spins. And usually this is done with magnetic field gradients. But there are other ways to encode the information. And we use in particular something that's called J-coupling. It's a scalar spin-spin interaction between nuclear spins and the molecule. And finally, our diamond or atomic vapor detector or squid, something like that, comes in the detection stage. And so now you can see that you can perform the entire NMR experiment without any need for magnets. So this is NMR without magnets then. So this illustrates one of the experiments. Here for polarization, we used parahydrogen. So this is a spin-ordered state of molecular hydrogen. By itself, these molecules are not NMR active, but here you have styrene, and there is a reaction with parahydrogen, and you produce ethyl benzene, and through the magic of quantum beads, this produces actually observable magnetization, and this is the spectrum of that magnetization. And we've been playing these games for a number of years now with my collaborator, Professor Alexander Pines at Berkeley. And these games are gradually becoming sort of a useful tool. For instance, in this paper, which is the PhD thesis of John Blanchard, we looked at various aromatic compounds recorded with these techniques. And you can see the spectra here. You can see that immediately that just tiny changes in the molecule here completely change the spectrum. So it's a very good signature. Then you look at something like this, and you first think, oh, this is some garbage. It's not garbage, because we blow this up. This is the experiment, and this is the theory. This is actually exactly predicted signal. And if we further blow up this region over there, then we see NMR lines of 11 millihertz wide, which is a pretty good line width for NMR, isn't it? Anyway, as another application, I would like to tell you that for measurement of geophysical field and for looking for magnetic anomalies, sometimes these sensors are flown on aircraft or spacecraft. And we participated in one of these experiments with our own sensors a few years back. This is Dr. Brian Patton. He was actually in the ground crew on that particular run, and I was one of the people in the helicopter. And underneath the helicopter, we had this object towed, and there is a magnetic gradiometer over there. And I should say there are various variations on all of these techniques, and one of the variations is that the components of the magnetometer, everything except for the vapor cell, can be sort of in one location, and the vapor cell can be separated. And here is where we had this, a cell separated 10 meters from the magnetometer itself, and it actually worked pretty well. And so this got us thinking, maybe we can do a really remote kind of magnetometry. And this brings me to another connection with Kastler's work, which I didn't actually know about before Professor Otten pointed this out to me. It turns out that Kastler was the one who was the first to study the sodium layer about 100 kilometers above the Earth, and then I started reading a little bit about it. Apparently the work was done already in 1937, but the first publication I was able to find was only after the war. Anyway, so there is sodium in the atmosphere about 100 kilometers above the ground. We can take a 589 nanometer resonant laser resonant with the sodium lines, and we can perhaps play some of our modulated light tricks in the atmosphere. Then we have to detect fluorescence, in this case with a telescope. So we worked out some of these details, and it turned out that indeed this works, and we can do magnetometry remotely from the ground and measure what magnetic field is in the atmosphere. And let me show you a couple of pictures how the actual experiments look like. This is earlier this year at the Tenerife. This is a 20-watt portable laser developed by European Southern Observatory, and this is a launch telescope. And if you go out, you see this. There is no Photoshop here. It's a real photograph. One of our colleagues is actually a semi-professional, or professional, I guess, photographer, and so he gets a beautiful picture. But that's actually what you see when the laser guide star is in operation. All right. Well, we already can measure magnetic fields 100 kilometers away. Let's think bigger. Let's think bigger. And the biggest problem in physics today is probably to understand what most of the matter in the universe is. And one of the ways we're trying to understand this is something that is a global network of optical magnetometers for exotic physics searches. And it's looking for a particular type of hypothesized dark matter, where dark matter consists of the energy in the axion-like particle domain walls. And so this is, I guess, I forgot I had this slide. This is just something that you probably have seen. This is the rotational curves of galaxies. So we do not really understand why the stars move with velocities that do not follow what we would expect naively from how much visible mass we see. And the only way to explain it in a satisfactory way is to assume that there is this other dark matter, and it's actually the majority of matter here. So in this particular model of dark matter, what happens is you have this pseudo-scalar field that's can take certain allowed values. But the value of the field doesn't have to be the same everywhere in space. And so there are domains of these fields similar to what you have in for example, a ferromagnet. And then when you are inside one of these domains, it has very little or no effect on your spins. But when the Earth passes through a domain like this, there is a quasi-magnetic field that causes spin precession that you can try to detect with the magnetometer. I should say this is not a picture of axion domains. This is a picture of soap bubbles, but that's what I could find on the web. OK, anyway, so what we do is we put some of the very sensitive magnetometers around the world. We they put them into magnetic shielding. So we don't see the real magnetic fields, and we synchronize the readings with the GPS timing. So, and then we try to correlate the signals using actually the same analysis algorithm as LIGO collaboration uses to detect gravitational waves. And currently, there is a pretty large and growing collaboration that does that. And we are running and taking data with these magnetometers, and it's been extended now to other types of sensors. So just to give you an idea, this is one of the stations for this network in Mainz. This is the multi-layer magnetic shielding apparatus, and this is the laser system. So if you go to our website, you will see the map of the world and where the stations are, and if you click on them, you see what they are and what they are doing. This is a particularly bad moment, but I downloaded this from the web because only two stations, one in California, one at Berkeley, and one in Freiburg, was running at that time, but we're trying to get it the duty cycle, so we run all the time with as many stations as possible. So I guess I'm approaching the end of my talk. So I briefly discussed optical magnetometry, the two platforms, vapor cells and nitrogen vacancy centers, and some applications like zero field NMR, magnetometry in the sky. I skipped the field, I guess, and also the use of magnetometers to look for dark matter. And in all of this, I hope you have seen a very close connection to the work of Kastler. I should say that I had to really limit myself in these connections, and even in our own group, there is other work closely connected to Kastler. For instance, we just published this paper about what? It's about optical pumping. This is about very efficient way of doing optical pumping where most of the processes are driven by stimulated emission and only very small amount, minimum amount of dissipation allowed by law, as we say in America, is used in this work. But I don't have time to tell you about this. And my very final remark, our chairman, before I go to this, I realized that I meant to mention something, but completely forgot that this use of atomic magnetometers to detect nuclear spins is something that was pioneered by Professor Cohen-Tanucci, and our chairman, I guess, who is a scientific grandson of Kastler, then, if I understand correctly. And now this wide use in zero field NMR is a direct continuation of those ideas. So sorry, I meant to say that, but forgot. Okay, but one thing that our chairman said that I meant to say is to make a connection between Kastler and another great man of science, Professor Charles Townes. And I guess Professor Harosh already said all the things here. I just want to say that unfortunately we lost Professor Townes in 2015, and actually within days of the tragic events in Paris here. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for this very complete talks about the use of optical pumping and magnetometry in various areas of physics. You mentioned this magnetometry experiment that we did back in the 1960s. And in fact, it was Claude was involved, and Jacques Dupont-Roch and Franck Ladeau, who was here, were doing the experiment together. In fact, we had a helium-3 cell sitting near a rubidium cell, and the precession of the helium nuclei was detected by modulation of the magnetometer signal, and we were amazed because we were able to follow the precession of helium for more than one day. We could go to the movies and come back, and we still saw these things going up and down, so it was very interesting. Any question about the talk? Christophe?
I have two questions. The first one is about the global network of magnetometer. So what is the signature? What would be the signature of dark matter in this system? Can you comment a bit?
Yeah, so this is the type of searches that's called axion wind. So there's a gradient in this scalar field. There is an interaction with the spins, probably nuclear spins, and that causes a magnetometer signal. If you have one shielded magnetometer, you would probably just see some sort of a spike. And you wouldn't be able to say if somebody dropped a screwdriver next door or you really have dark matter. But if you have a large network, then you have to have a very particular signature from which we can actually back off where this wall is coming from and what its speed is. And so that's much more powerful just than a single sensor.
And the second question was about the solar flares also are connected with huge magnetic field, and field lines. But of course you have shields.
Yes.
So it's a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah. So we have shields. So to first order, we take this out. We also have, as part of this network, auxiliary sensors outside, so we can veto these kind of things.
Okay, Bill.
You showed us some results from cells that have incredibly long relaxation times, like 100 times longer than has been typical before. How did you do it?
Well, Kastler said that it's a little more complicated than it would seem at first. Well, first of all, it's a different kind of coating. It's something that my collaborator, Dr. Balabas, proposed. This is not a completely saturated hydrocarbon chain. There is one double bond there. And the conventional wisdom was that this would be very bad, in fact. But it turned out he had an intuition, and the intuition worked out. And it turned out to be better. We still are working on trying to understand exactly what the reason for this. I wouldn't claim that we, maybe Madame Bouchia can say something about it. But I should say, by the way, I'm exceptionally, again, proud that we've just recently collaborated with Madame Bouchia on some of this work with the coating. So coming back to her PhD work. So
is this a what is the stuff like? Is it like an oil or a wax?
It's a candle wax, basically.
Okay,
That's what it is.
So it's a funny kind of. I mean, we used to use paraffin.
Yeah, paraffin. Yeah.
So this is like a funny kind of paraffin that's got
exactly.
double bond in it.
Yeah.
Wow.
I would like to say that there are other things. There are other tricks you have to play. For instance, there is a sidearm, and you have to close that sidearm so it'll work as a source of relaxation. And there is a special bullet that's also coated that is used for this. Then you have to work on reducing magnetic field gradients to a very, very good level. And finally, you have to get rid of spin exchange broadening, and this is done by using this spin exchange relaxation free technique in an unusual regime. So there is a lot that goes into that 77 relaxation time, 77 seconds, yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? If not, so let's thank again the speakers. And